All right, so this is video 19. This is the second video on Charles Mills' essay, Blackness Visible. I'm calling this video The Social Construction of Race. So the main thing that's happened since the last one is I had you do an exercise where you try to outline the various positions on the reality of race that Mills discusses. So I want to talk through some of those ideas. Actually, before we do that, let's talk about the first question on that exercise, the Blackness Visible exercise, which has to do with this quote from Ralph Ellison, Ralph Ellison's great novel Invisible Man. This is a part of this quote is used as the front of Mills's essay, or the front of the book that this essay is in. So the essay is called What Are You Really? The book is called Blackness Visible. And the epigraph from Blackness Visible comes from Invisible Man. So this is how the book opens. I am an invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids. I may even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you sometimes see in circus sideshows, it is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imaginations. Indeed, everything and anything except me. That invisibility to which I refer occurs because of a peculiar disposition of the eyes of those whom I come in contact. It is a matter of a construction of their inner eyes, whose eyes with which they look through their physical eyes upon reality. So my question was originally just like, why was this the epitaph for his book? And I think there's some pretty clear answers. Charles Mills is writing about his identity, about people's identities as black people, not just his own, but that experience in general. And Ralph Ellison's point in Invisible Man, the opening of it, was that the narrator is invisible because everyone just sees them through their own prejudices and perceptions and stereotypes about blackness or whatever, right? There's no actual visual contact between the person on the street and him. It's just all prejudice, preconceptions. So what Mills says he's doing in the book is making blackness visible. That is, understanding the perspective, trying to make the kind of perspective that he has visible to, among other things, an audience of philosophers. Okay, so we're talking in this section mostly about social construction. And so I want to again repeat a basic distinction I made earlier. Physical reality and social reality, right? So the easiest way to understand physical reality is, I know that itself is a pretty big claim, but I'll say it anyway. The easiest way to understand physical reality is that physical reality is the stuff that doesn't go away if you stop believing in it. In philosophical terms, this is sometimes called mind independence. Physical reality exists outside our minds. And I wanted to suggest that physical reality primarily consists of causal processes. So I gave the example of the Rio Grande. It's a river, It is a process where water flows down from the Rockies into the Gulf of Mexico, evaporates, and then condenses in the air and falls down as rain again, right? It's a physical process. And this process doesn't involve us. So it continues to go on even when we don't believe in it. Social reality is different, but social reality is dependent on people's minds. One individual can't back out of it, but if enough individuals back out of it, it ceases to exist. And so my example here was the Texas-Mexico border, which happens to be the same as the Rio Grande, the same location, but that's a social reality. And as an individual, I can't say I don't believe in borders and just expect to walk across and have nothing happen to me. But if the right individuals, with enough power, enough of them, agreed to change the way society works, then that social reality would change. So when we talk about social construction, we're talking about social reality. Now, one of the things I want to say right away is that this simple distinction that I just made between physical reality and social reality is fairly simplistic, and like a lot of real philosophers will start saying, "Oh, this is way oversimplified," but I think its simplicity is an advantage here. But people will say things. Will talk about social construction and physical reality too, and that's what I was going on about in the previous video about the definition of a moon. So when we perceive physical reality, we also have to deal with our own definitions. So we don't define certain other asteroids floating around near Earth as moons. We just define the moon as a moon. But that is our representation of physical reality, our set of concepts. And that's also socially constructed. But the physical reality remains a physical reality that exists independently of us because it's a causal process that we're not involved in. All right, so Mills in his essay outlines 5 positions that you might think of as being positions about race. And what he is doing here is he's drawing from the literature in the philosophy of science and ethics, metaethics in particular. So people have tried to understand both science and ethics in terms of how real they are. And so people will say, oh, ethics isn't real. What's real is just the physical stuff around us, and ethics is all just opinion, right? So it's really common for people to be, for instance, relativists about ethics. Ethics is all just opinion. But people can also be pretty sometimes hardcore about science and say, well, science is all a bunch of theories, that sort of thing. And so you get a lot of different ideas about how real these things are or how unreal they are. And so what he's doing now is just taking this terminology and borrowing it in order to talk about the reality of race, right? And so he identifies 5 positions: realism, constructivism, subjectivism, relativism, and error theory. And the big division here is between ideas that say basically race is a thing. Race is real, we have to talk about it. And positions that say race is not a thing. It's not. He uses real just for the position of biological realism. So when I talk about views that say race is a thing, he uses the term objectivist. The point is that there's an object there, right? There's a thing, race. We can talk about it. So, and he's upfront about the fact that his preferred position is a form of constructivism. So I just want to sort of run through these with some quotes and then talk about examples and meaning. So the 2 positions that say race is a thing in some way are realism and constructivism. And so what he says about the realist is a racial realist in the most minimal sense is somebody who thinks that it is objectively the case, independently of human belief, that there are natural human races. In other words, that races are natural kinds. And he dismisses this, and I've been dismissive of it, and I just want to say a few words to add to that. Think of it this way. You go to Ancestry.com and you get your DNA analyzed, and you might find out that 10% of, they will tell you, for instance, that 10% of your ancestors are African, or 50%, or 70%. And those numbers can be all over the map for even for people who and quite different from how people identify in their own lives. So people all the time who grew up as black find out that actually most of their ancestors are white and that sort of thing. And vice versa. There are white supremacists who find out that they actually have a lot of black ancestry. You might think that there's still some reality here because, after all, Ancestry is telling you something that seems like the truth, like a biological truth. But let's get this straight. Ancestry.com is just tracking certain genetic markers, which correspond actually to our socially our non-genetic understanding of people's ordinary ancestry, like, your just your family tree that you might research using gravestones and birth certificates and death certificates and marriage certificates, all of that stuff, right? They try to match up those genetic markers, which don't actually code for anything, with those and try and match patterns. So it's useful because it helps us understand direct lineage, but it isn't actually identifying biological race. This is the thing that I really wanted to emphasize. When they say you're 10% African, or 3% Cro-Magnon or whatever, that is just a percentage of markers. It doesn't correspond to any real division amongst kinds of people. So it doesn't, for instance, correspond to real divisions among skin tone. They're actually not checking the genes that control skin tone. There are a bunch of those, but they don't correspond to the things that we call race either. So hopefully, actually, this came across with the discussion of the white and black laxes, and the discussion of East Jackson, Ohio, and other cases where the question of someone's race becomes really weird and complicated, and you start to see it pull in different directions. No biological category corresponds to any of those social categories. Not even the results you get from Ancestry.com, right? Because those are non-coding sequences, right, of your DNA. They're not genes for skin color or genes for hair curliness or anything like that. So Mills's whole position is there's no biological reality to race. We're just lumping people together arbitrarily. But not arbitrarily. It's a product of a historical process. And so when Mills gets to his own position, he talks about how our practice of grouping people together collectively creates a kind of reality, what I'm calling a social reality. I just want to read a couple quotes here. Because people come to think of themselves as raced, as black or white, for example, these categories, which correspond to no natural kinds, don't correspond to anything in DNA or anything like that, attain a kind of social reality. Intersubjectivity, that is, the individual judgments of people that aren't about objects, they're just individual judgments of people, attain a kind of objectivity because you get a social construct. So race is a social construct like a border between two countries or money. Those are my two go-to examples of social constructs because they're very real, but they depend entirely on social practice for their continued existence. Mills, a little bit earlier than the previous quote, writes, "Race is not foundational. In different systems, race could have been constructed differently, or indeed never have been come into existence in the first place." So sometimes people ask the question, were the ancient Egyptians, when they were the people who built the pyramids, Tutankhamun and Cleopatra, were they black or white? And really the best answer is that they were not black and they were not white. Those categories had not been constructed at the time. When Cleopatra was alive, the two major categories were Egyptian and Macedonian Greek. The Macedonian Greeks under Alexander the Great had colonized Egypt. Those aren't black and white. Don't think of them either of those as black or white. They were their own categories. So when he says race could have been constructed differently, he means quite literally there have been other times in which race was constructed differently. Race is not essentialist. The same individuals would be differently raced in different systems. That is, you plop the same person down in different societies and they get classified in different ways. This happens actually even today because different cultures that are around now group races differently. And in fact, the United States is really weird because we tend to lump anyone, in the era of slavery, slavery followed a one-drop rule. If you had one drop of African blood, you were considered African and therefore could be enslaved. That is not the rule that most societies, even other slaveholding societies like Brazil, used. So you get these weird circumstances where someone emigrates from Brazil to the United States and their racial classification changes because things are done differently in Brazil than they are done here. Race is not metaphysical in the deep sense of being eternal, unchanging, a necessary part of the furniture of the universe. Again, I want to make a contrast with the moon. The moon is a part of the furniture of the universe in a far more robust sense than race is. But race is a contingently deep reality in that structures our particular social universe. But race is a contingently deep reality that structures our particular social universe, having social objectivity and causal significance that arise out of a particular history. So that is the view that he holds. Those are the two ideas that think of race as somehow actually a thing. The other side are views that think that race is just not a thing. Subjectivism. This is a term that comes up in ethics all the time. People will say, ethics is all subjective. Or they'll say it's just a matter of your opinion. So if you transfer that version over to race, you get the idea that, subjectivism about race would be the view that since racial designations are arbitrary, as constructivists would agree, one can choose one's race. So one can just announce that one is a new race, and that counts, regardless of how the rest of society socially constructs things. Relativism is another idea that comes up in the study of ethics. Since racial constructivism does not so relativism in ethics is just, the idea that ethics is relative to a society. what one society finds ethical, another society does not, and there's nothing deeper to it. So if one society has slaves, slavery is ethical in that society. If another society doesn't have slaves, slavery is unethical in that society. And you can't talk about the ethics of slavery apart from those two societies. There's actually a strong connection between relativism and constructivism, and he acknowledges that off the bat, because also for the constructivist, race or whatever is relativized to a society, right? Race is different in Brazil than in the United States, and different still than in South Africa or ancient Egypt. So in that sense, the relativist view is the same as the relativist and the constructivist view agree. Still, the relativist view doesn't think of race as a thing, and so really just wants to the one place where Mills suggests that the ideas really diverge is with the possibility of a sub-community of like-minded people creating new racial categories. I'm actually really not sure there's that much difference between a relativist and a constructivist, other than whether this higher level thing, whether you say race is real. And I'm not actually sure that's that big a deal. So personally, sometimes I go back and forth between the relativist and the constructivist view when it comes to race. But Mills seems to think that there's a firm difference. Okay, error theory is an idea that came up in ethics. It's associated with a philosopher named J.L. Mackie. And Mackie had a kind of scientistic worldview. So he says that, the things that really exist are the things that science tells us exist. Science says things like matter and force exist. Science says that doesn't find ethical ideas out there. No science is going to be able to measure your duty to honor your parents. Since it's not in science, it doesn't exist. Error theory. Basically, error theory says all of ethics is an error. The equivalent for race would be to say, race doesn't exist. And furthermore, that means that we can just stop talking about it. And this is, again, the point that I think Mills was most concerned with running away from, right? You can't, at the very beginning of the book, he's like, just because race isn't biological doesn't mean we can ignore it. Where these days people will say, oh, I don't see color. And other people, including Mills, I think, would say, well, if you don't see color, then you're ignoring a lot of problems, right? A lot of problems come from race. So if you say you don't see race, you're ignoring problems. So that would be part of his rejection of error theory. So here's a quicker version of it. Realism. Realism says race is biological reality. Constructivism says race is social reality. Subjectivism says race isn't a thing, so I am whatever I say I am. Relativism says race isn't a thing, so subgroups can invent races. And error theory says race isn't a thing, so talking about it is always a mistake. This is more complicated than the initial distinction that I gave you between physical reality and social reality. And already I'm coming up with things I want to argue about. So we're going to just leave it here. I'm not going to go into more detail. We're just going to say these are Mills's categories, and they're pretty good. So the last section of his essay actually talks about criteria for racial identity, and we're not going to have time to go into the details of this, but I think it's important because it once again helps us recognize how race is not biological. because we get 7 different categories. This is the third section of his essay, so I labeled them 3.1 through 3.7. You get 7 different ways of classifying people according to race, and none of them are the same, right? So you might classify people by their bodily appearance, but actually, Americans in particular just are terrible at identifying people's race. So what you guess someone is based on their appearance will not reflect their ancestry at all. A lot of people are really hard at telling the difference, for instance, between people of Asian ancestry and people of Hispanic ancestry. And, that's just because bodily appearance doesn't track ancestry very well. Ancestry has biological reality, I'll give you that, and that is what the kind of thing that Ancestry.com will track. But again, that's not race. That's just those are just lineages, family trees. Self-awareness of ancestry and public awareness of ancestry, right? When we think about our identity, it's not just like who our actual ancestors are. It's who we grew up thinking our ancestors are and who other people think our ancestors are. All right, so culture and experience. We obviously associate different races and ethnic groups with different cultural practices, and so you can just use those as criteria for identity. And in some places, it's perfectly reasonable for someone to say, "I am culturally black." This is something that happens in Brazil, for instance. The idea of blackness is less tied to biology, more tied to culture. And so changing your practices, people are more likely to say, oh yeah, that is now an acceptable way of changing your race. Experience is obviously related to culture, but it's what has happened to you already, not what you are doing now. And in many ways, a common set of experiences is often what will unite a ethnic group or a political organization or a group that has political importance. But in any ethnic group or other human group, what might start out as people understanding themselves as having a common experience quickly winds up diverging. So the experience, for instance, of middle-class African Americans and impoverished African Americans is quite different. You get this also when people talk about women as a social group. Is there a common experience that women have? And obviously, black women have a very different life experience than white women. And the final one is just subjective identification. Do you feel? How do you feel? And for a lot of people, their subjective identification is really strong and really important, and going against it is very, very hurtful. But again, we just want to note that these are very different categories. These are different criteria for racial identity. So what's going on here with these criteria for racial identity? If we say that race is a social construct, then what you have are a bunch of people running around classifying each other using some subset of these different categories. And generally, people will be using a mush of them and getting them confused. But somehow, from a mixture of how people categorize themselves and how they categorize each other and the different reasons they give for categorizing each other, this category, a category like race arises. So the last section of the essay talks about problem cases for this, and we're not going to have time to delve into this at all, but I think you can see how a lot of the cases that Mills is speculating about actually relate to real cases that we see in our primary reading in Henrietta Lacks. Okay, so that is the bottom. That is that is as much about the social construction of race as I feel like we can digest in this course. But it's important for understanding the story of Henrietta Lacks because we see over the course of that story that race is socially constructed in different ways by different people.